Brilliant. Okay. Hello and welcome. This is an EP Reach Out webinar this afternoon, and myself, Hayley, and Joe are going to talk to you about applying the Power Threat Meaning Framework to education. I'm Sarah. I'm an educational psychologist, and I'm really interested in applying this framework to my work and thinking about how we can use it in education to inform our thinking around children and young people. I'll let Hayley introduce herself next.
Hi, thank you everybody for joining us. We really feel really privileged that you're showing an interest in this topic, and we're really keen to share it with you. So my name's Hayley. I'm an educational and child psychologist. I currently work in Milton Keynes, and like Sarah was saying, it's really that how it's inspired our thinking and how we can bring the framework into our practice. That's kind of driving this group and driving this session today for you. So I hope you enjoy it.
Hi, welcome everyone. I'm Jo Yeoman. I'm educational psychologist and practicing in Sheffield. And again, like Hayley and Sarah have said, thanks for coming and being part of our journey and your journey on the PTMF framework. We've worked quite a lot over the past few years to kind of bring more information into the world of education. It's primarily a clinical model, so we're on a journey and excited to use this in our practice as well. So thanks for coming today.
Thank you. So I'm just going to give a general overview first of the framework and just some of the key concepts around the framework. So Power Threat Meaning Framework, the main document was first published in 2018. It was a product of sort of 5 years really hard work from the lead authors that you may have heard of, Lucy Johnson and Mary Boyle, but they're always very kind of find it really important to share that it was a collaborative process. There was lots of authors involved in creating the framework, and they had service user campaigners involved, Jackie Dillon and Eleanor Longdon, and there was a consultancy group of service users involved as well. So, it's a real collaborative process that took many years to create. And the main kind of idea, the main reason it was developed by sort of clinical psychologists to be an alternative to more traditional models of psychiatric diagnosis. So the idea was to really sort of try and move away from a purely symptoms and classification way of thinking about emotional distress, and sort of find more holistic ways of viewing what happens to people. And that's really what we're going to sort of think about today, and think about how that applies to education as well. As I say, it was sort of published in 2018, and it continues to evolve, and that's what we're doing as well, thinking about how it can be applied to education. And I'm aware it's been used a lot in social work, in kind of prison reform, thinking about those sort of areas as well, to really think about how we can conceptualize emotional distress differently. The authors themselves acknowledge that original document is quite dense and detailed. So on the British Psychological Society, there's a Power Threat Meaning Framework website, and there's summarized versions, there's a long version, there's supporting documents and things like that. So there's lots of different ways to sort of pick up and read about what the framework is. We often sort of talk about the yellow book, which I probably can't see with my blur there on there, but it's a book written by Mary Boyle and Lucy Johnson, which is the straight talking introduction to Power Threat Meaning Framework, and we use that quite a bit as well. So what I'm going to sort of think about next is just a few of the key concepts that Power Threat Meaning Framework invites us to think about. And really what I want to do is sort of think about that in terms of my reflections as well, of why it resonated for me as an educational psychologist. So I think I was sort of been trained for about 5 years when it came out, but it really aligned with my training and a lot of the thinking that I was doing as an EP working in local authorities. So, those ideas around emotional distress and the reactions we have to events can be understandable when viewed in the context of a person's experience. And those experiences can be personal, connected to family, community, social, and then things like injustice and inequality as well. So they're all closely linked with how we experience distress. And that's what the Power, Threat, Meaning framework was trying to get us to think about. And that really sort of resonated with me with thinking about the person or the child in context. So not just thinking about, you know, what's wrong with that child, but thinking about all those layers of influence that can have an impact on how a child or an adult is responding to day-to-day life. And I think the Power, Threat, Meaning framework really invites us to think about the narratives that we have and the meaning that we can make around emotional distress as well. So what narratives do we have available? What's the dominant discourse about that we can use to explain how we think? And that's often really linked with social and cultural narratives as well. So it's really important. And I think, again, that there's a section quite near the beginning of the framework where it's saying about the purpose is to actually open up a space to think about and identify the different layers of meaning and experience and influences on emotional distress, and not seek to kind of pathologize or really kind of take it within person. So it's kind of, I say, opening us up to think about all of the things that can happen to us that create distress. And I suppose those narratives is another important element to think about. That even though, I mean, the Power, Threat, Meaning framework is offering an alternative to what we know is kind of a westernized approach to having sort of a diagnostic manual and looking at sort of mental health and distress in that way. But it's also sort of giving us an invitation to you know, think about that and embrace some of the different cultural expressions of distress and respect those and understand them, where they don't always fit into those kind of classification in the, say, DSM. And I think what I liked as well, you know, I try to be a sort of strengths-based psychologist and look to see what's working and what we can change in a positive way. And there's an element of that which we'll touch on through the webinar a little bit more about how we can create new and hopeful narratives about our responses to experiences of distress. And again, that's what we'll touch on, allowing us to think about our strengths and how they can guide our thinking differently. So yeah, so I think that's sort of giving a bit of an overview of the different elements of it. And I think, you know, what stood out for me as well is the elements of, you know, it draws on trauma-informed approaches as well. So it allows us that sort of thinking around, which I know is the slide coming up, around what's happened to us, which makes me think about, you know, viewing behaviour as a communication, really sort of digging deep into, you know, what is going on and what is impacting on the way we might act or react in certain situations. And here is an infographic which was created by Juliet Young. She does a lot of really useful infographics, not just the Power, Threat, Meaning framework, but I think here we use this quite often to explain to teachers or, you know, other people what the framework is and how we can work with it as educational psychologists. And I know Joe's going to sort of think in a bit more detail about these areas, but here you can see it's just inviting us to think about how power is operating in our life and what threats that they might bring up for us. You know, how does that power, how do the things that are happening to us affect us, and what meaning we make of that? And then that sort of ties into the response that we have. And as I've already mentioned, we can think about what power resources we do have access to, and what strengths we have to support us. Yeah. So I think that's a quick overview of the concepts, and I'll pass on to Joe now.
Okay. Thanks, Sarah, for those reflections. I know we've been on a journey with this, and that you can really hear how you've embedded that in your thoughts and your practice. So the next slide that I'm going to guide you through is thinking about the elements of the PTMF. And we're thinking about that narrative journey. The kind of three key elements are the power, the threat, and the meaning. And we use these kind of key areas to kind of help us approach this framework. And giving us that idea that our experiences shape our sense of self, shape how we interact and understand the world, and then from us supporting the young person, where are they, what's happening for them, and when we're curious about that in terms of our work and our consultation and our sitting with those situations with their family in the school, etc. It'll be in one of our references for our minutes for our special interest group. There's a really good paper, Bodfield and Colshaw, and that was a paper which really started to break down the idea of how the PTMF linked in with here she is, hi, linked in with the educational context. So I'm drawing upon some of that today, so thank you, Callum, that's brilliant. So we really want to kind of make sense of this in terms of our everyday, our work as well, in terms of thinking about moving away from, this behavior, this is a problem, etc. We're kind of breaking down about the rationale, about where that's coming from. So I'm going to take each sort of concept in turn and break that down a little bit as we speak today. All right, Sarah. Okay, so you can see in this slide there's a lot of information, because there, as Sarah mentioned, one of the things that Lucy says, and our colleagues, Lucy Johnson, that the original work is a big, massive sort of piece of work, and there's lots of different elements to, and it was really quite comprehensive. And as Sarah mentioned as well, the yellow book is a little bit of a distilled version of that and more accessible, I would say, for our work as educational psychologists in terms of that. But thinking about these kind of key areas of how power operates in our life, they've broken it down into these kind of key areas: ideological, economic, coercive, legal, biological, embodied, interpersonal, social, and cultural. And there's these are examples that are mentioned in the framework. And what I wanted to do was kind of draw upon educational sort of elements of this and kind of make that make sense for us as educators. So in terms of ideological, you can kind of make links with maybe things like academic achievement, 100% attendance, the role of the DFE, meeting norms, expectation, the query that you have to conform, you have to achieve, you've got to get all of these different GCSEs, etc., and there's no alternative for that. So there's a narrative around achievement and kind of focus on that from an education point of view, potentially. From an economic point of view, there might be some power sort of operating around the need for more resources, and there's not enough funding, there's not enough resources in schools to kind of really meet the children's needs. The coercive power could potentially be linked in with the reflection around this. Might be something like an overarching sort of element of a process like Ofsted, who have kind of given you that idea of that surveillance, you're kind of keeping up with a framework. Have you met these standards, etc.? Behavior policies, you could even kind of feel like coercive in terms of that. And then the internalized pressure for a young person to feel that they have to live up to these behavior policies and, warn, remove situations, etc., as soon as they come into those sort of school environments. And potentially legal sort of aspects of sense of power in an education context. You might be thinking about something like, again, the Ofsted sort of link with that. Maybe even EHCPs. I was thinking about the idea that some of my SENCOs, they're working really hard with our children on a graduated response, but yet maybe a parental request might come in, and so they've taken away that sense of kind of and being on an impactful journey with that young person, because there's a new sort of legal framework, a new sort of set of guidelines that they must follow to support the child's needs when they potentially have got lots of other things they might want to be doing in the meantime for that one. potentially reflect on a biological embodied sort of aspect of that. You might want to be thinking about things like labels, diagnostic sort of frameworks, etc. Maybe elements of racism, things like that. So it's a mixture of sort of a kind of embodied sort of aspects that will be coming up. I'm going to explore diagnostic sort of labels, etc. in a little bit more detail as well. Potentially interpersonal aspects. I think we talk about this a lot, and I think we're on a real strong journey with that as an educational psychologist. That trauma informed aspect from an interpersonal perspective. How's our young people feeling in terms of the relational safety? Is there not a sense of sort of safety in the school? Do they have a sense of belonging when they come into the school? I'm interested in how our children transfer from primary to secondary. Do they still have that same sort of sense of knowing where they're going, how they feel connected, etc. And I think there's a lot of sort of sense of that as well. And then that kind of last section talks about social cultural sort of aspects as well. It also mentions belonging, but I think in a wider sort of sense of that as well. That sort of embodied sort of power around academic learning over sort of creativity, individuality, etc., and kind of moving into all of those sort of aspects. So you can see the idea, it feels quite sort of like top down, quite sort of claustrophobic, the idea of the kind of power. But when we have the information, we can think about where it's kind of coming from, and it just gives us more information how we might support the young person. So I'll present it in a slightly negative way, but it does give us a starting point for consultation and support. Okay, going over to that one, Sarah. Thank you. So then, as we noticed on the first slide, we've kind of moved from the idea of the power into the threats, sort of an element of that. So when we try and interpret this, we kind of think about what that element of power is doing and what the resulting threats might be for the young person, so that it feels more kind of, I can kind of relate to these in terms of the psychological sort of leaning into them in terms of that as well. What we're thinking about that relational sort of aspect, people feeling let down, a sense of sort of discrimination, rejection, exclusion. There's not, when children are excluded, that sense of shame, that kind of, there's not an ability to reach in with the people around them. There's no co-regulation there. So those threats of that and that narrative is just feeding into that all the time. That's what we're really interested in. And the sort of emotional aspects of that, maybe a young person kind of feeling like they're being bullied, or there's a lack of control, and there's a perpetual cycle of not understanding themselves, not having that platform to move forward for that one. Maybe bodily threats might, kind of not being physically well, being in pain or discomfort, etc. Maybe coming into school really hungry, not having enough to eat. So they're not ready for the day. They're not ready to kind of have that. So those, the kind of aspect of the power is that context of the home environment and the community that they're in. Potentially, they're not having enough to kind of set them up for the day in terms of that one. Again, keep thinking about that sense of community as well. Maybe feeling like they're in a different sort of settled environment, and maybe they've moved. There might be a refugee status, etc., and they've moved, and they just don't feel connected with that as well. Similar to that, with the economic sort of aspect, poverty, and we know there's direct links with achievement and well-being in terms of that. We don't need to go on about that. From an environmental point of view as well, children moving, again, like I mentioned, about feeling unsafe in the home, where there's sudden changes, or also children who are very sensitive, just sensitive in different ways, might feel really overwhelmed by a larger environment, like a secondary environment or a noisy environment, etc. And we'll unpick meaning and making sense of environments a little bit more as well. So, and kind of that values, that making meaning of things. Again, I mentioned that earlier on about the academic versus creativity, not being able to feel that their individuality is being nurtured and they can't express themselves. So that sense of agency is starting to get lost, a little bit eroded, and you might get young people who are quite sensitive at that stage, and they're not being able to grow and develop. So all of these things can help with our sense of formulation around what might be going on for the young person. So there's a thread through, as I said, the power and what might be seen through those threats, what might be impacting upon that young person as well. Okay, Sarah. Thank you. So the next one, again, is that thread moving through, and this is what we're interested in as well. These are the kind of things that people often say to us, oh, I want to refer this child, for these different reasons. And you're unpicking it from here. But what we want to be doing with the PTMF is kind of tracing that back. We want to be sitting to think about where they are, contextualizing that, and what that means to the young person. How have they got to that sort of sense as well? And I was also struck by the idea that many of our young people might not be able to label how they're feeling or process what the distress they've experienced from they might have experienced a very difficult experience or a trauma sort of perceived experience, or they might not have the verbal sort of ability to kind of express that as well. I'll unpick that a little bit more in a minute. And there was a author that I read earlier, Wiseman, and he was warning us against that sense of being othered, and kind of have a sense that there's something wrong with you, and that impacting on the identity and the sense of self as well. And again, we mentioned that ideological power, what a child get, the sense of what meaning they're kind of gleaning from the situation that they're in, and what messages we're kind of thinking about from that. And it made me also kind of thinking about that kind of internal working model of where you are and what you're kind of what message you're getting about yourself, and obviously the ability to kind of boost yourself up. Okay, so that's another sort of key element. So that what happened to you is telling the young person telling you about what happened, and then you helping them understand and make sense of the situation from your perspective as well. That being that shared narrative with them. Okay, thank you, Sarah. Okay. So this is an interesting sort of aspect for me as well. I do a lot of work with young people potentially on the autism spectrum, or maybe awaiting the autism sort of diagnosis and the ADHD diagnosis. I'm really interested in that aspect in terms of that. And I questioned Lissy Johnson when she came with us, and we were asking about that, and she had said that her sort of thoughts around the diagnostic sort of process, she would indeed be supportive of that if it felt like it was part of the young person's narrative, part of their journey. So I thought that I related to that and thought, is there ways that I could support that, thinking about how children could, or any young people or adults, reframe and have that sense of identity through that narrative sort of journey as well. So promote that positive ideology, not a deficit, or there's not wrong with you, but we're curious about, how this sort of makes sense to you as well. The other aspect I want to kind of drill in with this slide a little bit more is that children, first of all, they don't need a diagnosis to be understood. We can understand the specific parts of it, but you might see some of the responses that children have to those threat responses to that sense of power, and it's filtering down through. And you might see, I've sort of thought about it in terms of kind of internalized, externalized sort of threat responses, maybe survival responses, being really stressed, like, fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, or classic ones that we talk about, don't we, in our training as well. And also the EBSNA type work, where maybe some of our children feel so hopeless, so overwhelmed that they're not coming to school, they can't face it, and it's that perpetual cycle. It's about tracing that back, not that the idea that they're not not wanting to do it, but where does that come from? We're tracing that back, and we're always thinking about our formulation. We're zooming out and thinking about where that connects in. And you might get some young people, unfortunately, get so distressed and so overwhelmed that they might engage in self-harm behaviors to themselves, challenging behaviors towards other people, to kind of get that situation under a sense of control for them, because it's too overwhelming as well. Or young people, as we know, we talk about things like masking as well, don't we, with our young people, moving away from that. But again, what we want to do is lean into the power threat meaning and think about how do we validate those experiences, how do we be with our children, how do we co-regulate with our children, how do we stop and sort of think about what might be happening, and we can do that through our consultation when we make time for that as well. And some of the things that we've been developing as a group graphic facilitation ways of doing that to kind of zoom out and sort of think about how we get those views together. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the last slide for me, Sarah. Thank you. So obviously, as EPs, we're ever positive. I would say we're always looking for the sun and the clouds. That's what I always feel we're like that. So for example, we're always thinking about ways around that, and some of our trauma-informed work in schools, as you know, and we might be thinking about things like relational policies rather than behavioural policies, etc. We're thinking about what's going on for that situation, and we're thinking about, you know, how we can support teachers reframe that, you know, kind of ideological sort of power and give positive language, a sense of self, to help children understand the influences that are coming through the media, etc., and work with those aspects. And I think our work in terms of thinking about pupil views, we do that all the time. We're super skilled at that, and thinking about building up that narrative, giving that platform, and reframing that identity, just being with our children whenever we meet them in whatever element of life that they're in at that point. And we're really thinking about building their strengths and resilience, acceptance and understanding, and from that. And I think we can do that through the PTMF and training, consultation, and pupil working in our reports. We just need a wee bit of space and time. I think we've got all the skills to kind of build on that as well. So yeah, that's my section. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. I'm just going to jump back in here for one slide and just offer, Joe mentioned there a little bit about formulation and consultation, and this slide really shows how we can bring the power threat meaning framework to life in consultations, the questions we can ask around what we've just thought about, the how is power operate in your life, that what happened to you, that really trauma-informed question. How does it affect you? What threats does it pose? And things like that. This is, again, if you go on to the BPS website, there's quite a lot of resources there, like a flow chart and some work done by Jigsaw with children and young people, to really help you adapt this in different ways. I mean, these are the questions that are in the power threat meaning framework that are there posed to think about the different elements that Joe's just gone through. But these are questions that we can ask a teacher, we can have in our head as kind of an implicit guide to help us think about our consultations or what we might want to find out. And they're questions that you might ask anyway. You know, what's going on? Tell us about what's happening. Give us an idea about what sense you're making of what's going on, you know, what's happening, and what are your strengths. I mean, we ask that of our children and young people and the teachers that we work with all the time. So I think this is just a really good guide to take us through the power threat meaning framework in terms of, let's say, consultation, making sense of it, making it functional, making it sort of active. And I think Hayley's going to sort of talk a little bit more about some of the things that we've been developing as a group, but we've been looking at, you know, how we can visualize this, as Joe said, taking these questions and adapting them in a sort of solution circle type approach, and doing different things like that. But I'll let Hayley carry on that thread now.
Thank you, Sarah. So we've already touched on the fact that the PTMF came more from the clinical context, the clinical world, thinking about how we understand distress, you know, mental health difficulties through previously perhaps the medical explanations and perspectives, and actually how we can use PTMF to think differently and reframe the distress that people might experience through things that have gone on in their lives, their experiences. But it was predominantly from that clinical context and from that adult population. And so something that kind of struck Joe, Sarah and I is that we really resonate with the model, we really relate to it, we could see how it links so seamlessly in terms of EP practice and how EPs think and approach their work. And so that was where the kind of group idea came in, and one of the activities we did in the group is we sent a survey around and we asked people for their thoughts on how they're already thinking about drawing upon the PTMF in their work, in their EP day-to-day practice. And there was a whole range of ways that people have started to think about and use the PTMF in their work. So as we've just touched on, it's a really powerful tool to use within formulation, and people reported how they've used it in their formulations. Potentially they've written that up, so they've made it explicit in their report writing that they've drawn on the framework. Other people talked about how they were using it more implicitly to guide their thinking. So we're drawing on the framework to, perhaps with those guiding questions from the slide before, to shape their approach, to shape the formulation that they that's developed as a result of that, but not necessarily naming it and labeling it in a report. But some people found that was also helpful to do. Some people even reported they were utilising it and being explicit with the framework in EHCNAs as well. So there was a whole range of ways that people were drawing on the framework in consultation, again, implicitly having the model in mind, explicitly sharing perhaps the infographic with a member of staff and saying, I'm thinking around this model, I want to talk to you about this model and how this is shaping my thinking, and making that explicit in that consultation process. For some, it's been useful as a guiding tool when working with different professionals as part of a multidisciplinary approach, as well as it being really influential to the development of thesis research and other research projects, and widely other projects as well. And again, that kind of implicit explicit argument comes through in terms of research, because some people talked about how it was a kind of core guiding framework for their thesis, and others their reflection and discussion drew upon the power threat meaning framework. There are some ways in which we might use this with children and young people. So we, again, in our group, we're thinking about visuals and tools that we can use to make the language accessible, make the framework something that we can draw upon with teachers, SENCOs, parents, children, young people as well. So there's a whole host of ways that we're looking into using it, developing it, adapting it to apply to our work with children, young people, and in education settings. Thank you, Sarah. And I think the next slide just goes into some of the ways, some of the examples of how the power threat meaning framework is coming through into research, into thesis research. So we've got another EP reach out seminar webinar coming up soon. Demi Stroud's research. So she was looking into how EPs and TEPs have experienced the power threat meaning framework and used it within formulation. So if you're interested in this as a kind of taster session about PTMF, definitely sign up to that next session coming up soon. You've also got there on the slide States of Mind. So States of Mind is an organisation. It's kind of a collaborative organisation with young people and psychologists, and they're thinking about helping young people make sense, make meaning of their experiences, make meaning of their distress, to consider the societal and the kind of wider influences for children and young people and how they're feeling, and to build resilience and kind of to thrive and to go kind of into the world with strength and with those kind of power resources and that self-awareness and the awareness of the factors that are influencing them. So that's a really interesting, I think the website link has just been popped on the chat there. We did have States of Mind come to talk to the group on one of our earlier sessions as well. So you can see how the power threat meaning framework is starting to be applied, starting to come through into research, different project works, thinking about emotional experiences, thinking about emotional distress, thinking about how we might be able to use it as educational psychologists as well, and how we might relate to the framework in our practice. I think that's that for that slide. Thank you, Sarah. We have a special interest group kind of vision and dream. That's why we've established the group. Initially, we were thinking about finding like-minded people and joining together. Who else might be interested in this framework? Individually, we see its merit, we resonate, we relate to the model. We could see how it links to our practice, but we were unsure about the other people that wanted to connect and be part of that journey as well. So initially it was kind of building awareness, kind of finding the common interests with people, sharing the knowledge, sharing our experiences of using the framework, and developing a little bit of a bank of strategies and ideas, maybe growing our confidence to go out there and apply the framework. Obviously, then what we were hoping to do is to continue working to explore how do we apply the framework to our work, how do we keep adapting it, making it meaningful, making it accessible for people, how do we apply that to help young people engage with the process as well, and to be part of that empowering process for young people to make sense of what their experiences are, make sense of what their trauma, their threat responses have been to those experiences. So that would be, as you progress through this slide, you see the kind of more of the dream aspects to the group. We haven't achieved all these things. These are things that we would hope to kind of be able to work towards as we go through and as we continue this group. We talked around how we might use the framework to develop specific patterns of distress that are relevant to children and young people in education settings. So a bit like Joe described initially about, how do we conceptualize the framework with an education lens? Perhaps we might be able to develop those specific patterns of response, specific patterns of distress that we notice around school avoidance, behaviour that challenges, different situations that we come across in our practice, and how we might create young people in education specific patterns of distress. And then kind of beyond that, again, the big dream, the hope is that we might be able to have some impact, some influence in beyond our little group, that wider influence in the education system for young people that access the education system, for the teachers and the staff, to make that a more informed, empowering environment for young people to be set up for life, really, which is what we're all hoping that our work helps towards. So that's where we're at, and where we're hoping that we might work towards a bigger dream and a bigger goal. So the group, if you're interested in attending, we started the group back in May 2022. It's come a long way, I think, from those initial shoots that we started finding other like-minded people that thought that it would be a relevant way to spend our time getting together, reflecting on how we use the framework. We've had 11 sessions so far. We've had a wide range of interest from different people joining sessions, either interested in hearing more and learning more, or to present on aspects of their work or their thesis topic, or the States of Mind organisation I mentioned before. But collectively, we've got this vision of how we might apply the framework to our work with children and young people in an education capacity. As it says here, we've had lots of different people come and present, and we continue to think about how we might best do that, other people we might be able to invite. There's more research as we go along. There's more research that involves the PTMF. So there'll hopefully be more presenters as well as we go through future meetings. Recently, we've adapted the structure of the group as well, so that we have an hour for perhaps a presenter or a topic or a theme, and then we have a half an hour for a reflective space afterwards. And again, it also makes it adaptable for people's busy schedules. So if you can come to the first hour, the second half an hour, or the whole meeting, people can drop in and come to what they can. So that was kind of a couple of reasons why we thought we would adapt the structure of the group, which I think has been working well for the group so far. But we tend to get people that want to come and stay for the whole thing, but we do appreciate that it's a big time commitment for people. I think we run 3 or 4 a year, so we find some people can come back to a couple consecutively, but otherwise it is difficult to make time for these things, isn't it? Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
That was all I had to say on that one. If you wanted to round us off with the last slide.
Yes, I will. Thank you, Hayley and Joe. And I'm aware we've gone over time. So, really, I'm just going to let these final thoughts and takeaway messages and next steps just sort of be on the screen for you to look at. So, we hope we've given some kind of overview of the multi-layered aspects of the Power Threat Minion framework and how we can apply it to our work in education. And that idea that emotional distress can be understood by looking at the impact and influence of the context that we live in, and influences by power structures and things like that, and then threat responses, our best attempts to sort of survive adversity in difficult situations. So, as I say, we hope we've sort of given you a bit of an insight into that, and that then it will spark your interest. Maybe come along to the group, maybe have a look at a bit more of the resources. I'm lucky enough to be working on the EP doctoral training myself, and having questions and thinking, and going back to the framework myself and really looking at it afresh is really useful. There's always something new to find, so I appreciate that. So yeah, please think about how you might use it, how you might map it onto the work that you're doing already. We've thought a lot about how it aligns with, frameworks we already use, Brenner, you know, um, social, learning, social graces, and lots of different things. Self-determination theory. I was sort of thinking of Hayley. She's done a lot of work in that herself. There's a webinar of Hayley talking about that, so you can find that too. And yeah, please join the group. Help us think about how we might use this differently, how we might, extend our thinking. We're always up for ideas and ways to evolve this. So thank you very much for joining us today. As Hayley said, Demi's coming along in June to share some specific research that she's done. So please sign up for that. I think we're well over time, so we probably haven't got time for questions today, but I don't know if there's anything you want to finish us off with, Hayley or Joe.
No, all good. People can come to the group, people can reach out. And I think there's been some comments about people wanting to come to the group, so absolutely.
Yeah, please.
And there's a request in the group for resources, and we've got loads of really good resources, and we all look for resources as AP, so we can get you connected in with our Google Drive, and that's been quite a long time in the making, so we can kind of connect that with, and you can see what we've been developing.
Yeah, no, that's if you sign up to the group, then you do get the link to our Google Drive, which has got all of the stuff from the presenters that have been, our thinking, our ideas, as rough and ready as some of them are. It's great to share them. So yeah, please sign up to the group, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you for joining us. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye.